Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell just had his nomination hearing before the Senate, and they grilled him on all things economy, inflation, and the jobs market. And Congress had a lot of questions for Jerome Powell about the future of our economy and what the Federal Reserve is going to do in order to combat inflation and make sure our economy doesn't struggle anymore. And Jerome Powell had a new response to inflation in which he said the Federal Reserve will use all of its available power in order to make sure that this new higher inflation does not become too far entrenched within our economy. And what that basically means, translated in English, is that the Federal Reserve may get a lot more aggressive on inflation in 2022. Maybe even more aggressive than we previously thought. So today I wanted to take a minute to talk all about this latest nomination hearing that Jerome Powell just had before Senate. I want to talk about everything that he said in terms of our economy, inflation, and the jobs market, and what exactly this is all going to mean for the Federal Reserve in 2022 and beyond. But before I get into all of that, my name is Nate from Minority Mindset News, and if you like this video, then smash that thumbs up button below and hit that notification bell too. That way YouTube shows our videos to way more money minds around the world, and we can keep making videos just like this one. And mark your calendars, money minds, because this very channel is going to be called Market Briefs starting on February 1st, 2022. We have a ton of other cool announcements on that same date as well, so be sure to stick around till then. Okay, so let's jump into exactly what Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said at his nomination hearing. Essentially, he said that the Federal Reserve is ready to start raising rates even more aggressively if they start seeing inflation get way too out of control. In Jerome Powell's mind, this will help supply chains and demand start cooling off all throughout the economy, which will ultimately start bringing inflation down. Jerome Powell also said is that what we have now is a mismatch between demand and supply. We have very strong demand in areas where supply is constrained, such as for cars. And that the Federal Reserve is going to do whatever it can to kind of bring an equilibrium to those things. Demand and supply need to equal one another in order for inflation to start going down. In addition, Jerome Powell talked a lot about what the Federal Reserve has done over the last 2 years. He mentioned that it is time for us to move away from those emergency pandemic settings and do more to bring our economy to a normal level again. Now, it's important to talk a little bit about what the Federal Reserve has done over the last 2 years. Now, many of you have known that Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve have been in the news a lot lately. And the reason being is because the Federal Reserve is in charge of a lot of the monetary supplies in the United States. And the monetary supply of the United States has a massive impact on how high or low our inflation rate will be. Basically, it's the Federal Reserve's job to make sure the United States Treasury is not printing too much or too little money. We need money in our economy. There's always going to be inflation because our economy is always growing and we're always going to need more money. When you have more money in an economy, you have a lot more room to grow. You can essentially give more businesses more money and more workers so that they can create and build more things. However, if you start printing way too much, then that means there's way too much money circulating throughout the economy, and that means that inflation is going to start going up because more people have way more money to spend. And that is exactly what the Federal Reserve did over the last 2 years in 2020 and in 2021. You see, when the pandemic first started, nobody really knew what was going to happen, and businesses were closing down left and right. We didn't know if we were going to have any money to spend, and businesses didn't know if they were going to have any money to pay their employees. So that's when the Federal Reserve and the federal government decided to step in and provide trillions of dollars in economic stimulus. Now, this stimulus would allow the country to spend more money. Spending money is how our economy works, and it worked. We saw millions of people all throughout the country start getting money even though they weren't working, and it kept our economy from dipping into a depression. Sure, we had a short recession, but it was because of all of the money printing. They wanted to incentivize people to start spending money, so they basically made money very cheap. They made it very easy to get your hands on a lot of cash. Some of the things that they did was drop their benchmark interest rates to 0%. 0% made it so that just about anybody could get a loan, a car loan or a mortgage or just about any loan that you can think of. There was also trillions of dollars being poured into stimulus measures like direct checks to Americans, the Paycheck Protection Program, and extended unemployment benefits. So Americans had a ton of money and they were going out and spending a lot of this money. But that ultimately caused a lot of issues because, as many of us know, we are running into massive supply chain issues right now, something that Jerome Powell actually mentioned in his nomination hearing before Congress. He talked all about supply chains, and mainly, there's not really much that the United States and the Federal Reserve can do about our supply chain crisis. The United States can't exactly start forcing companies or companies abroad to start making more goods and to do it even faster. That is ultimately going to come down to those businesses and how those businesses can create more. The only way for a business to create more is to hire more workers and to build more factories and work on their logistics so that way we can have an increased supply throughout the United States. But that's going to fall on the businesses. The United States government can provide incentives, but that's about it. But like I said, with all of that money going around, that meant demand was very high. And even today, demand is super high in the United States because our unemployment rate has gone from around 15% in 2020 and in parts of 2021 all the way down to 3.9% in December of 2021. That means that you have millions and the vast majority of Americans currently employed. Everybody is making money, and even though not every American is making a ton of money, Americans are making money. This means that the Federal Reserve is going to have to print even more money. And the pandemic in general has had a lot of effects on our economy, both socially and financially. Something that Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve are now taking into account. Our economy is evolving, and the Federal Reserve is going to have to make new monetary policies in order to work around our evolving economy. Now, that brings us to today. Jerome Powell talked about what the Federal Reserve is going to do in order to drop inflation in our economy. He was asked about how the Federal Reserve is going to tighten its policy when it comes to interest rates and its quantitative easing measures on Wall Street. And he said that raising interest rates multiple times could come perhaps later this year. It's important to mention here that he hasn't really given a complete and direct time frame for when that is going to happen. A lot of experts have said that this new tapering and raising interest rates for the first time in 2 years could happen around spring, so March or April. Those two things essentially lower demand in our economy. So in 2020 and in 2021, the Federal Reserve was trying to get people to spend money. Because people were spending money, our businesses and people all throughout the country weren't failing. If people stop spending money in our economy, that means our economy is shrinking. There's a lot less need for money. So the Federal Reserve wanted people going out and spending a ton of money. So it was pretty easy when they were giving people thousands of extra dollars and the federal government was offering a ton of incentives. People were saving a lot more because of the mortgage moratorium program, and federal student loans were paused through January 2022, and now they've been paused again until May 1st, 2022. But now the Federal Reserve is kind of backtracking a lot of the things that they've talked about over the last 2 years. They've started addressing that inflation is no longer transitory and that they need to start pulling back a lot of their stimulus so that the country can start functioning normally again. Jerome Powell said that our economy is not functioning normally right now and that we are a long way away from that. And they really started this conversation all the way back in November of 2021 when inflation hit a new 40-year high of around 6.8%. It was at this point that they discussed starting to taper on Wall Street. Now, when the pandemic started, the Federal Reserve entered the market on the New York Stock Exchange. They started to buy billions of dollars every month in bonds and treasury notes in order to push the market up and not allow it to crash anymore. This is all in a response to one of the fastest stock market crashes that we have seen in its history. In March of 2020, the stock market crashed, and it crashed hard. Now, we've seen the stock market go all the way back up, and this is for a lot of reasons. For one, Americans have had a ton of money. Some Americans absolutely needed this stimulus. I don't want that to be misconstrued in this conversation. However, a lot of Americans didn't need this additional thousands of dollars in stimulus, so they went out and spent it, or they went out and started to invest. That is part of the reason why the stock market has exploded, reaching new record highs in 2020 and in 2021. But the other major reason is because the Federal Reserve has been pouring billions of dollars into the stock market every single month for the last 2 years. And now they have a balance sheet that is around $8 trillion. And they're going to start reducing that sometime this year. Now, as of December 2021, they pulled a little bit back on the amount of assets they were purchasing on Wall Street, and they expect to continue to do this in 2022. In addition, they talked about raising their benchmark interest rates in 2022 around 3 times, but this is all assuming that inflation is going to steadily start to drop. And Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve is optimistic, but not certain that this is going to happen. I mentioned it at the beginning of this video, but supply chains. That is one of the biggest reasons why we are facing such high inflation in our country right now. Supply chains are not something that the Federal Reserve or the federal government can control. All of our supply chains are managed by private industries. And if private industries are facing the Great Recession and a massive labor shortage, well, then you're going to start seeing prices go way up. And this is something that the Federal Reserve can partially address from their side. This is something that Jerome Powell addressed in his hearing today. He said that inflation is one of the biggest threats that our job market is facing right now. This is because right now we are facing the Great Resignation, and one of the reasons why millions of people are quitting their jobs all at once voluntarily is because of inflation. One of the symptoms of inflation is that everything in your economy starts to cost more. This is because as people have more money, they go out and spend it. If people are spending so much money, that means businesses have to start producing more. And if they start producing more, all of that comes at a cost at hiring more workers and building more factories and delivering more things. Everything costs something, and eventually they trickle all of that cost down to you, the consumer. But it's not just businesses here who are raising prices. It's also energy like gas and electricity. And it also is housing. So the housing market has exploded over the last 2 years, and now home prices are around 20% higher than they were at the end of 2019. That is a massive jump in just around 2 years. And that's just the average. You have some areas where housing prices are completely out of control. That's because with all of these incentives that the federal government and the Federal Reserve have been bringing to the table over the last 2 years, people got mortgages, and they got mortgages at record rates because this was a time to get a home. Your interest rate on a home could make or break whether you get a mortgage or not. And if you couldn't afford a specific interest rate before, now interest rates have essentially been sliced to around 2.75%. So you're essentially saving hundreds of extra dollars every single month on your mortgage and hundreds of thousands of dollars over the lifetime of your loan. That is massive savings and a massive incentive for people to go out and get a home. But there's only so many houses on the market, so we saw demand create a housing market explosion. And what that ultimately meant is that people that could no longer afford homes had to start going somewhere. And they found apartments all throughout the country, but that meant that apartments were becoming in short supply. So rent is going up for apartments, and also mortgages are very hard to come by because people can't find a house anymore that they can can afford. Now, this is expected to decrease over the next few years because the Federal Reserve plans on raising its benchmark interest rates. It'll become a lot harder for people to get a loan. But this directly affects jobs, because if you are sitting at your desk right now and you're trying to figure out, how am I going to afford rent? How am I going to be able to afford putting food on the table every single night with the paycheck that I get right now? A lot of people are realizing that and quitting their jobs. They're going out and trying to find new jobs. And the problem that we're having right now is that there has been a ton of money throughout our economy over the last 2 years. So a lot of people have the savings to back themselves up in order to give themselves time and months to find a new job. In 2019 and just before the pandemic, Americans didn't really have a lot of savings, but in 2020 and in parts of 2021, we saw record saving rates. Now, what do Americans save for? They save for emergency funds and for the things that they want. Emergency funds are when you lose your job or something else catastrophic happens in your life. And I would definitely recommend one, but the point here is that Americans now have money. Money that they can use to protect themselves and essentially quit their jobs. That means that Americans became wealthier in 2021 because inflation was still very slow and we saw records on the New York Stock Exchange. So the Americans that were already doing pretty well in 2021 were investing their money and getting super high returns. This allowed for millions of Americans to retire early and for a lot of Americans to cash out and get a lot of profit that they can just use to quit their job for a few years, and that is having a big toll on our economy. So all of that together is kind of contributing to inflation, and it's making inflation to get even higher in the United States. Now, what is the Federal Reserve going to do about inflation in 2022? Well, they've kind of mentioned this a little bit already, but they're going to start getting even more aggressive when it comes to inflation. And what Jerome Powell just said in his latest hearing shows that they might even get more aggressive than you might think. It's the Federal Reserve's job to bring inflation down and to create monetary policies that bring inflation down. And they want to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of control either. So right now they kind of have to find that middle ground between raising inflation and lowering it. One of the things they can do is raise their benchmark interest rates, but they can't do this too fast. If the Federal Reserve gets super aggressive with its interest rates and starts raising them way too quickly, well, that could create a recession because now nobody has access to money. It's impossible to get a car loan. It's impossible to get a personal loan, and it's impossible to get a mortgage. That could send our economy into a very quick recession. So they can't raise interest rates very quickly. In addition, they can't just yank all of the money that they've been pouring into the New York Stock Exchange. That means that retirees could lose a lot of money, and that means that investors will lose money in general. With billions of dollars suddenly drying up and disappearing from the market all at once, then that means that the stock market could tank and we could potentially see a crash. But with all of that being said, the Federal Reserve has talked about raising interest rates 3 times in 2022. But Jerome Powell just said that if they have to raise rates even more, then they will absolutely do so, which means we could see 3+ interest rate hikes in 2022. In addition, they've said that if they need to taper more, because it looks like the stock market might be functioning normally now, then they will do that as well. So basically, a lot of their stimulus could dry up a lot faster than a lot of investors and experts have anticipated. And all of those measures will ultimately drop inflation, but there are consequences for every action. Sure, the Federal Reserve raises its benchmark interest rates 4, 5, and even 6 times in 2022. Not saying they're going to do that, but it's a possibility. Then that means people will have a lot less access to money. However, now there's a lot less money flowing throughout our economy. And remember, only way that our economy functions is if people are spending money. But the Federal Reserve right now is focused on getting our economy back to a normal level. So normal spending, normal saving, and normal investing like we saw in 2019. So they have to take demand from very strong and very high to a normal level. this will hopefully equal out with the supply of everything in our society, so our supply chain issues will start disappearing and demand will go down because nobody has as much money as they did in 2020 and in 2021. Hopefully, and this is something that the Federal Reserve is very optimistic about, that will bring inflation down. Now, they said that they're anticipating inflation will be at around 2.5% in 2022. That would be considered a relatively normal rate, still slightly elevated, but normal for the Federal Reserve. That would also mean that people who are working can make money and not everything around them is getting more expensive, so there's not a lot of reason for them to quit their job other than if they don't like their job. So employment could also begin to stabilize throughout the United States, which would fix the Great Recession and our labor shortages as well. Now again, none of this is absolutely guaranteed, and it all hasn't even been fully mapped out yet by the Federal Reserve. They're expected to make a full report on exactly what they're going to do in 2022 very soon. But all of this, everything that I mentioned and everything that the Federal Reserve can do in 2022 depends on what inflation is. If inflation continues to go up, which means demand is getting even higher and our supply chain issues and labor shortage is getting even worse, and that means the Federal Reserve is going to have to do even more in order to stop inflation. But if inflation starts to go down and the Federal Reserve doesn't have to do too much more than it was expecting right now, and that means that our labor shortage is starting to end naturally and our supply chain issues are going away too, which means Federal Reserve can basically just coast and do a small amount of raising rates and tapering in 2022. But nobody really knows what is going to happen next because all of this is assuming that we are now starting to be a post-pandemic society. Our pandemic has raged and has destroyed economies all throughout the world over the last 2 years. And if the pandemic doesn't go away like a lot of experts think it will, then that could basically put us back in the same situation that the Federal Reserve and our federal government was facing back in March of 2020. Businesses closing and essentially nobody making any money, which means all of this could be speculation because the Federal Reserve may have to put back into place a lot of its financial policies. The Omicron variant continues to set brand new records for the United States every single day. On January 10th, 2022, the United States recorded its most ever virus cases in a single day. 1.5 million people have contracted the Omicron variant. That means our pandemic isn't really going away. In fact, it's starting to get even bigger. Now, studies have come out that this new Omicron variant is less deadly and less serious when compared to the original strain of the virus and the Delta variant, which means even though people are contracting it, our pandemic might still disappear. And of course, medical technology is advancing every day. We now have vaccines and we have new antiviral drugs in order to prevent people from dying or spreading this virus. So it is a little bit of a different situation than we were facing in 2020, but the pandemic is still here. And even though we will most likely not face widespread economic lockdowns, businesses and some events might close on their own, and that means less people are spending less money. It also means that with the pandemic raging, people are a lot less likely to go into crowds or to go into big box stores and spend their money. And the United States needs that money, so if the pandemic continues to get worse, you could see a lot less spending, and that could mean that inflation starts to go down too, but it also could mean the United States is starting to go into a recession. Our economy is starting to shrink. So like I said, there is a lot of moving parts here, but the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell are optimistic about our economy in the future. Jerome Powell actually said that our economy is growing at a faster pace than it has in a very long time. And it's all because of what the federal government and the Federal Reserve has done in the last 2 years. But there are still countless experts who have said that the Federal Reserve is way behind on the curve of inflation. They need to do way more in order to combat it now, or else the United States is going to be in deep trouble. But I want to hear exactly what you think about this inflation issue. Should the Federal Reserve be doing a lot more when it comes to inflation, or have they done enough already, and inflation will naturally start to decrease in 2022. In addition, what do you think about our pandemic being the biggest variable to our economic recovery in 2022? Do you think that the pandemic is actually going to get worse this year, or do you think it will essentially disappear and our economy can finally go back to normal? As always, whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button below. Keep hustling, money minds, and I will see you all in the next one.